Aaron Weber never wanted to make enemies, least of all in the place he chose for a fresh start. After 20 years in corporate logistics, managing distribution chains across half the eastern seaboard, he'd had enough of boardroom wars and email politics. The burnout didn't come in flames but in a slow erosion of purpose, and when his company offered a severance package during restructuring, he took the out without hesitation. With the money, he bought a modest but promising house on the edge of a quiet residential neighborhood, several miles away from the city he used to commute to every day. It wasn't grand or new, but it had good bones, a clean title, and, most importantly, a private driveway that curved in off a secondary road, offering him the kind of separation he'd never had living in high-density developments. That driveway, narrow but lined with mature oaks, felt like a small shield against the world, a piece of land that belonged to no one else but him. The neighborhood was pleasant, at least at first glance. Lawns were kept to regulation length, flower beds were over-engineered with seasonal rotations, and every trash bin sat facing the same direction like soldiers in a silent parade. Aaron kept to himself for the most part, not out of arrogance but preference. He was the kind of man who waved to neighbors without asking names, fixed things himself even if it took all day, and brought deliveries in before the box had a chance to absorb heat from the sun. He didn't need much, and he asked for even less. His focus was on settling in, updating the outdated wiring inside the house, and slowly restoring the old cedar panels along the porch without hiring overpriced contractors. The only odd note in the neighborhood's otherwise dull harmony came from occasional paper notices tucked under his front door. They weren't official-looking, just home-printed sheets referring to standards of visual continuity, or reminders that certain colors and materials should be in keeping with the architectural identity of the community. The first one mentioned that his gravel driveway appeared incongruent with the prevailing aesthetic. Aaron, unsure who had left the note or on whose authority, simply ignored it. His deed stated clearly that the driveway, like the small portion of land it sat on, was fully private and outside of any designated community maintenance boundaries. The property was old enough to predate the local residential association, which meant that its exemptions were baked into the title. He double-checked the documents just to be sure, but the title was ironclad. The easement was recorded decades ago, during a time when zoning laws were looser and neighborhoods hadn't yet become gated pockets of self-enforced order. Still, the notes kept appearing. One said that his unpaved surface could pose safety risks during inclement weather. Another hinted that the uniform perception of neighborhood value might suffer if non-standard surfaces were allowed to persist. These weren't legal notices. They were thinly veiled attempts to pressure him into conforming. Aaron didn't respond. He figured whoever was behind them would eventually lose interest. He underestimated how much time some people had for small wars. Then, on a Wednesday morning in early fall, Aaron opened his front door and froze. The air still held the crispness of the season, but his breath caught for another reason entirely. His driveway, his private driveway, the one with crushed stone and shaded edges, had been completely covered in fresh, wet concrete. Not just patched or edged, but sealed end-to-end in smooth gray, poured clean and even like a sidewalk expansion project. The texture was professional. It had been screeded and cured in broad, confident strokes, and just near the base of his porch stairs was a small embedded plaque, the kind you'd find on public infrastructure. Surface renovation. Performed in accordance with residential safety. and aesthetic regulations. Aaron didn't speak. He didn't move. His first thought was that someone had mistakenly poured on the wrong property. Maybe a contractor got the address mixed up. But as he stared at the plaque, a slow burn began behind his ribs. There was no contact name, no company listed. The concrete still gave off that dense chemical steam of setting aggregate, meaning the work had been done no more than a few hours ago, probably overnight. He grabbed his phone and opened his front camera, scrolling through notifications from his driveway-mounted motion sensor. Nothing. The app showed a small gap in its coverage from 2:03 a.m. to 4:16 a.m. He'd had issues with it recently, something about firmware failing to auto-update. Of course. He walked down the edge of the slab, his boots crunching against the trimmed grass, and saw that the pour extended all the way to the curb, where it had been rounded off and blended into the existing sidewalk like a professional city crew had handled it. But he hadn't requested it. He hadn't agreed to anything, and no one had even knocked on his door. By noon, he had already filed a police report. The officer who arrived was sympathetic but non-committal. There was no immediate property damage, he said. No broken locks, no forced entry. Technically, no law had been broken unless Aaron could prove financial loss or trespass with malicious intent. Civil issue, probably. He advised contacting the local neighborhood board to ask if any contractors had been authorized to work in the area. Aaron didn't like the sound of that. He knew what it implied. He spent the afternoon emailing the municipal building department. No permits for driveway work had been filed on or around his address. No road crew had been dispatched. No record of utility markings. In other words, this was off book. The following day, he received a printed letter slipped under his door, this time in a white envelope. No return address. Inside, a single typed sentence read, "Concrete enhancements were made to protect and elevate community standards." That was it. No name, no contact. Nothing but that sterile phrase that sounded less like a justification and more like a euphemism for, "We did it because we could." Aaron felt the old professional instincts kicking in. Document everything. Escalate only with evidence, and don't tip your hand too early. He knew better than to lash out. Instead, he scanned the letter, took high-resolution photographs of the entire concrete surface, and made notes of tire marks that suggested a small work crew had pulled in, backed out, and left without a trace. Still, what disturbed him most wasn't the fact that it had happened. It was the casual boldness of it. The quiet arrogance. Someone had spent real money and effort to alter his property without permission, with the confidence that he would either accept it or be powerless to fight it. He remembered something an old supervisor once told him. Watch out for the kind of people who don't ask. They announce with action. That's what this was. An announcement. Aaron didn't plan revenge. Not yet. But he also didn't plan to let it slide. If someone was willing to tamper with property lines under the guise of vague aesthetics, what would be next? Shared driveways? Mandatory landscaping? He wasn't going to be the guy who sued over flowers, but he also wasn't going to roll over. What he needed now wasn't just a solution. He needed leverage. Something they didn't expect. And he had a feeling he knew exactly where to start looking. The next few days were a lesson in controlled frustration. Aaron had spent years dealing with logistical chain disruptions, cross-departmental chaos, and unpredictable contract partners. He knew how to stay level-headed when things spun off course, but there was something uniquely infuriating about fighting shadows. The concrete was there, solid and irreversible. The silence from whoever had poured it was louder than any denial. And no one, not a neighbor, not a city official, not even a groundskeeper seemed to know, or admit knowing, anything about it. That, more than the act itself, gnawed at him. He wasn't used to being treated like a fool, and he especially wasn't used to being dismissed with silence. He filed a formal request for information with the county clerk's office, specifically targeting any land use modifications, maintenance agreements, or emergency municipal orders within his parcel's coordinates. The response took 2 business days and came with a boilerplate email. No modifications had been recorded. No road work, no authorized surface treatment, no registered contractors. In legal terms, what had happened to his driveway was completely off the books. Aaron didn't find comfort in that. It confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't negligence or a bureaucratic error. It was intentional. With that confirmation in hand, he reached out to a real estate attorney. Not one of the slick billboard guys who boasted of fighting for every penny, but a quiet, precise land use specialist whose website listed obscure zoning victories and a deep familiarity with old easement laws. Her name was Clara Monroe. She returned his message that evening and scheduled a consultation the next day. Aaron met her in a compact office space above a notary service, where framed black and white maps of the county from the 1950s lined the walls. He explained everything: the concrete, the anonymous notices, the city's lack of involvement, and the unnerving silence from the surrounding community. She listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily across a yellow legal pad. When he finished, she asked one question. Has anyone tried to claim the driveway isn't fully yours? When he replied that no one had said so outright, she nodded thoughtfully. Then, the game is positioning. They're not interested in fighting you directly. They want to reshape how the land is treated, first physically, then legally. Clara filed a formal notice of property interference that afternoon, along with a demand for any parties involved in alterations to identify themselves under penalty of civil liability. She explained that without a named respondent, it wouldn't trigger court proceedings yet, but it would serve as a legal marker, a warning shot. Meanwhile, she advised Aaron to do nothing to the concrete. Removing it prematurely might be interpreted as destruction of community-funded improvements, which could muddy the legal waters. Aaron followed her instructions, but each time he stepped onto that slab, the resentment deepened. He watched neighbors slow their cars to admire the upgrade, some even giving him a thumbs up as they passed. The implication burned. He was supposed to be grateful. He'd been forcibly modernized, absorbed into an aesthetic standard he had never agreed to join. He wanted to tear the plaque out with his bare hands. 2 days later, something new arrived. A printed document in his mailbox, not mailed, but placed directly inside. It wasn't folded or stamped, just a pristine envelope with his name printed in sharp digital font. Inside, a full-color map was enclosed. A revised neighborhood layout, color-coded and marked with zones labeled Unified Entry Aesthetics, Vehicular Integration Priority Area, and Pedestrian Continuity. His parcel was outlined in red, and next to his driveway was a box labeled Transition Surface, under review. There was no source listed on the map, but he recognized the formatting style. It was nearly identical to materials issued by the local residential management board. Aaron brought the map to Clara. She examined it carefully, frowning. "They're creating a paper trail," she said. "None of this is legal, but if they distribute it enough, they'll frame your property as being in a gray zone. Later, if you challenge something formally, they'll argue there was precedent. Look, it was part of the continuity plan all along." She explained that while the driveway was undoubtedly his private property, neighborhoods with active residential, boards sometimes pushed visual or infrastructural boundaries to gradually assert de facto control. It was a long game, and Aaron had just been dealt the opening hand. Clara's next move was more assertive. She sent a certified notice to the local management board requesting immediate disclosure of any initiatives, reports, or proposed changes involving Aaron's parcel. That same day, Aaron made a quiet visit to the city planning department. He had no appointment but asked to speak with someone in zoning review. After waiting 30 minutes in a fluorescent-lit hallway, He was led to a back room where a tired-looking supervisor reviewed his printouts. The man confirmed that no rezoning requests had come through for Aaron's address. Then he paused and added, "But off the record, I take a look at the parcels on your street that were redrawn in 2011. Sometimes these boards submit blanket visual projects that never go through us. They just circulate them among the community to create compliance by perception." That phrase, compliance by perception, echoed in Aaron's head all the way home. It explained the notes, the silence, the fake map, even the timing of the concrete pour. It wasn't about legality. It was about manufacturing consensus until resistance looked like nonconformity. It was social architecture disguised as infrastructure. He spent that evening reading the original deed again, going line by line, comparing easement details and surface access notes. That's when something caught his attention, not on his property, but on the adjacent one. Across from his home, directly opposite the newly paved driveway, was a narrow stretch of curbside land, about 20 feet long and 6 feet deep. According to the old utility easements, it had been designated for municipal access but had never been formally incorporated into any city map. More importantly, there was no recorded owner in the current tax database. It was a clerical ghost, neither assigned nor maintained, just a leftover strip that everyone ignored. The next morning, Aaron returned to the planning office and submitted a request to review dormant parcels. It took a clerk 40 minutes to locate the file. As she scanned through the old documents, her brow furrowed. "Huh," she murmured. "This parcel was scheduled for city reclamation in 1998, but it was never completed. Nobody followed up." She looked at him. "You want it?" "Yes," Aaron said without pause. "I want it." "What for?" He smiled politely. "I have a small idea. Just need some curb space." The clerk shrugged and handed him a form. "Well, if you're serious, you can file for temporary license of use while the city verifies title abandonment. It's a pilot program. They like to see citizen use before formal reassignment." She gave him a quick summary of the process. He would submit a use proposal, pay a small processing fee, and, if approved, gain temporary renewable rights to use the parcel for a defined purpose. The process would take 3 weeks. Aaron walked out of that office feeling the tension in his chest begin to shift. Not because he had won anything, yet, but because he had found the lever. The people who poured concrete on his land wanted conformity, consistency, predictability. They wanted straight lines, smooth surfaces, and quiet submission. But if there was one thing Aaron Weber knew better than logistics or zoning codes, it was how to move around pressure. They had forced him onto a slab. Now he would make them pay for every step. Literally. Aaron's request to the city wasn't granted quietly. Within a week of his temporary license application for the curbside parcel, the tone of the neighborhood began to shift in subtle, unmistakable ways. The first sign came in the form of an email, not from the city, but from a newly created community beautification task force, which claimed to be organizing efforts to streamline visual consistency throughout the neighborhood's public-facing assets. It wasn't addressed directly to Aaron, but the message clearly hinted at concerns about unusual private use of shared space and the importance of preserving long-standing communal rhythms. He read it twice and forwarded it to Clara, who replied a few hours later with a single sentence, "They're spooked." As the city processed his application, Aaron made no public moves. He said nothing to neighbors. He didn't mark the parcel or block it off. He merely waited, all while continuing to document every development, every piece of correspondence, every quiet signal that suggested someone was watching. The most telling development came on a Monday morning, when he stepped outside to find 3 city workers standing on the curb directly across from his driveway. They weren't paving, digging, or measuring. They were simply standing there looking down, occasionally glancing at clipboards and gesturing without any real purpose. Aaron approached them casually and asked if they needed anything. The man in the middle, whose vest identified him as a junior municipal contractor, offered a strained smile and said they were conducting infrastructure inventory. Aaron nodded, thanked them, and went back inside. He didn't need confirmation. He knew someone had asked them to show up, not to act, but to observe. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a notification from the city. His request had been approved. He now had temporary rights to use the parcel as he saw fit under the terms of a public use enhancement clause. It wasn't ownership, not yet, but it was a foothold. Legal, documented, and timed perfectly. Within hours, Aaron arranged for a portable parking meter to be installed on the strip. He sourced it through a municipal-grade equipment supplier, paid up front for a 6-month lease, and customized the machine's digital display to read, Community Access Zone. Visitor parking only. 7 Huge jar after 30 minutes. By the following day, the curb had been marked, the meter installed, and a slim signpost planted at eye level that stated, clearly and legally, that this was a licensed urban experiment space under the city's temporary use initiative. There was nothing aggressive about the signage, no dramatic slogans, no threats, just facts. Still, the impact was immediate. That strip had been a default drop-off spot for neighborhood committee members and regular visitors to the residential board's office just down the block. The visual message couldn't have been louder if he'd painted it in neon. Someone had reclaimed space that was never meant to be noticed, and now they were charging rent for time that used to be free. It took less than a week for the complaints to start. First came the passive-aggressive ones. A note left on his windshield one evening, typed and unsigned, read, "This isn't the kind of neighborhood that nickel and dimes its own." Another, slipped into his mailbox, simply said, "You don't belong here." Neither one rattled him. He'd expected worse. But then came the direct actions. Someone scratched the side of the parking meter with a key, leaving the long diagonal gouges across the screen. A few days later, the payment terminal was covered in peanut butter, deliberately smeared over the keypad and coin slot. It was juvenile, sloppy, and desperate. Aaron cleaned it off without comment, installed a small weatherproof trail cam across the street facing the post, and sent the footage of the vandalism to both Clara and the city's program manager. He knew better than to retaliate. Instead, he leaned into the structure he had legally built, reinforcing it with every response he made. Clara advised increasing visibility. The more legitimate the program looks, the less room they have to undermine it, she said. So Aaron designed and printed a simple brochure titled Civic Space Recovery Project, which he placed in a locked holder next to the meter. It explained that the Curbside was part of a trial initiative to promote fair, low-footprint urban functionality on unused land. It sounded bureaucratic, purposefully dull, and exactly like the sort of thing a city would sponsor. It also gave him room to operate. Now, anyone challenging the parking meter wasn't attacking Aaron. They were opposing an official-looking initiative backed by municipal logic. What Aaron hadn't expected, though, was the escalation to come from inside the very structure that had ignored him for weeks. The residential board, long silent, suddenly sprang into action. An official letter arrived, this time postmarked and on branded letterhead, stating that Aaron was in violation of neighborhood uniformity standards by implementing an unauthorized monetized device within visual proximity to community property. The phrase was absurd. Every word reeked of overreach, but it was also dangerous. Clara immediately filed a cease and desist response, attaching the city's temporary license, meter lease, and program approval forms. Still, the move signaled something important. They were ready to play dirty. The board called for a special community meeting, and Aaron, sensing it would be unwise not to appear, attended without fanfare. The room was filled with the usual suspects: retirees with nothing to lose, mid-level professionals looking for small bursts of power, and the self-appointed keepers of aesthetic order. At the head of the table sat Karen Donnelly, one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood and an unofficial enforcer of whatever she believed community spirit meant at any given moment. She was the kind of woman who smiled with her teeth but not her eyes, who used words like tradition as a code for my control. And it was her who stood, after a performative round of pleasantries, to deliver a thinly veiled attack. In recent weeks, she began, some of us have noticed a growing trend toward privatization, monetization of what used to be community resources. It's concerning. It's divisive. It changes the character of who we are. She never said Aaron's name. She didn't have to. And while we understand that the city occasionally entertains strange proposals, she continued, we must ask ourselves, who benefits from turning shared space into profit? Aaron didn't rise to defend himself immediately. He let the silence sit for a few seconds before standing and calmly stating, the land I've licensed was never claimed by this board, never maintained, and never taxed. It existed in legal limbo for years. If anyone should be asking who benefits, it's the city, for finally seeing it put to use. He handed a printed copy of his agreement to the secretary, then sat down. Karen gave him a tight smile, the kind that said, this isn't over. The board didn't vote on anything that night. They never intended to. The meeting was theater, a warning. But Aaron had been through worse in far less polite rooms. The next day, someone left a dead possum near the meter, a grotesque message wrapped in the same ribbon used on community welcome baskets. Aaron called sanitation, took photos, and logged the incident with the city as an obstruction of public space. Then he installed another camera. This wasn't a game anymore. This was pressure, and it was only going to get worse. But Aaron had no intention of blinking. They had poured concrete on his property without permission. They had tried to erase his driveway and fold his land into their curated fiction. Now they were facing something they couldn't reframe, couldn't paint over, and couldn't ignore. A legally sanctioned structure that exposed just how flimsy their control really was. He wasn't just defending his space. He was remapping the boundaries. One line of concrete at a time. 2 weeks passed with the kind of slow, deliberate tension Aaron had come to expect from the people around him. No one said anything directly, of course. There were no open confrontations, no formal declarations of war. Instead, the conflict simmered in the margins, in the way people avoided eye contact at the mailbox, in the sudden absence of pleasantries from neighbors who had once waved, in the exaggerated sighs when cars couldn't use the curb across from his home. Even the local kids who once biked past with a careless freedom now crossed the street before reaching his house, warned off by parents too cautious or too petty to allow proximity to the parking man. It would have been funny if it weren't so deliberate. Aaron kept his calm, though. He didn't escalate. He documented. He waited. Then, one afternoon, Clara called with a tone he hadn't heard from her before. Measured, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. "We've got something," she said. She'd spent the past few days submitting requests for financial transparency under the Freedom of Information Act, targeting the public expense records connected to the residential board's activities. What she uncovered wasn't explosive, not in a headline-grabbing way, but it was enough to shift the leverage. According to invoices, the concrete poured on Aaron's driveway had been paid for through a discretionary beautification fund, a pool of money intended for minor community enhancements like tree pruning and sign repainting. The problem was, the records didn't list a specific property for the expense. The line item simply read, Surface Unification, dated 3 days before Aaron found his driveway sealed. More interesting still, the contractor listed wasn't local. It was a mobile paving outfit based 2 counties over, known for overnight work and fast, untraceable projects. Aaron felt a quiet surge of vindication, but Clara warned him to hold it. "It's not about exposing them," she said. "Oh, it's about boxing them in. If we use this now, they'll deny everything, deflect, blame miscommunication. But if we wait and they try something else, we'll have pattern behavior. Then we strike." Aaron agreed, and for the first time he realized that this wasn't just a defense anymore. They were building a case, not out of rage or vengeance, but precision. And the tools weren't loud. They were quiet. Paperwork, permits, patience. Still, the board didn't remain idle. A new sign appeared one morning near the board's office, a laminated notice mounted on a wooden stake, declaring the area part of a community continuity corridor. The sign didn't mention Aaron or his parking meter, but the message was clear. This space, this entire stretch of the street, belonged to a larger vision now. One that didn't include disruption. One that didn't include him. He took a photo of the sign, logged it, and said nothing. Then, just as the conflict seemed to settle into another lull, something unexpected happened. Aaron received a formal invitation, not a notice, not a demand, but an invitation, to attend a presentation hosted by the board, showcasing a proposed redesign of the neighborhood's public-facing features. The language was polished, courteous, and soaked in euphemism. It was being framed as an inclusive planning session, an opportunity for residents to give feedback. Clara reviewed the invite and said, "They're setting the stage, either to publicly humiliate you or to frame you as uncooperative if you don't show. Your absence will be noted. Your presence will be used. Choose which you prefer." Aaron decided to go. The meeting took place in the local library's community hall, a neutral ground, chosen, no doubt, for its appearance of openness. The board had set up a digital projector, a long table with refreshments, and a small model of the neighborhood printed in foam and plastic. It was oddly cheerful, like a science fair with a political agenda. The presentation began with a slideshow, smiling children, trees, pastel renderings of benches and walking paths. Then came the real content, renderings of proposed changes to neighborhood infrastructure. Among the slides was one labeled Driveway Integration Concept, featuring a rendering that looked suspiciously like Aaron's property, except the driveway was gone, replaced with a paved loop that merged seamlessly into the street. It was marked Community Access Lane. Aaron said nothing, but when the slide passed, Clara, seated quietly beside him, whispered, "Take a photo, now." After the presentation, Karen approached them with her signature composure, all smiles and soft tones. "We hope you found it inspiring," she said, handing Aaron a glossy handout. "We really do want everyone to feel part of the bigger picture. Sometimes progress just takes a little letting go." Aaron met her eyes and held her gaze for a long, silent moment before replying. "Letting go of what's mine doesn't sound like progress. It sounds like theft with good PR." Karen didn't flinch. She simply nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she already believed. That evening, Clara reviewed the slideshow photos with a level of intensity Aaron hadn't seen from her before. "This is more than arrogance," she said. "They're preparing to file a retroactive claim of easement. That concept slide? It's a visual seed. If they show it enough, refer to it often, they'll use it to argue that your driveway was always part of a transitional plan, even if it wasn't." Aaron leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. "So, what do we do?" he asked. Clara looked up from the screen. We shift the narrative. We stop playing defense. The next morning, Aaron requested an expansion of his Curbside project. Not a physical expansion, but a procedural one. He submitted a proposal to the city's public use initiative suggesting the integration of a second meter, coupled with a visual upgrade, reclaimed wood framing, native plant landscaping, and a QR code linking to the city's sustainability pilot site. The request wasn't about money, it was about presence. If the board wanted to weaponize aesthetics, Aaron would meet them in their own language and do it better. Within a week, the city approved the add-on, citing strong community engagement metrics. The second meter was installed, discreet but functional, and the plantings followed soon after. Neighborhood response was immediate and divided. Some residents, especially those who rarely interacted with the board, praised the addition for its charm. A few even started using the meter out of principle, slipping coins in just to show support. Others, particularly those tied to the board, treated it like a virus, something invasive, offensive, and threatening. But Aaron didn't respond to any of it. He watered the plants. He cleared the sidewalk. He maintained the meter. He stayed visible without being confrontational. And all the while, Clara continued compiling everything. The presentation slides, the fake easement plan, the beautification fund misuse, the contractor records, and now a growing pattern of coordinated obstruction. Aaron understood now. This wasn't just about a driveway or a parking space. It was about establishing the right to refuse absorption, to assert that private property wasn't a flexible concept to be reinterpreted when convenient. And more than anything, it was about showing that calm, methodical resistance could be just as effective as outrage. Maybe more so, because while the board wielded control through suggestion and pressure, Aaron wielded something they couldn't match: recorded facts, documented processes, and a refusal to be erased. It was early October when things began to crack in earnest. Not the kind of breaking that comes with drama and spectacle, but the quiet kind. The slow shifting of plates underfoot. The building of tension you don't notice until everything you're standing on suddenly feels unstable. The second meter installation had been a calculated move, a precise escalation wrapped in polite paperwork and municipal logic. But it had also drawn a line in the sand. Aaron knew it, and more importantly, so did they. The response wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. For the first time since the concrete pour, the board stopped pretending to be indifferent. The first wave of pushback came through city channels. A concerned resident had submitted a petition to the Planning and Zoning Commission requesting a reassessment of the Curbside parcel's temporary license. The petition cited public confusion, vehicular interference, and aesthetic disharmony. It wasn't hard to guess who had filed it, but the names on the document were harder to trace. All were residents of the broader district, but only one lived on Aaron's street. Clara reviewed the document and raised an eyebrow. "They're trying to fabricate consensus," she said. "If they can show that the project causes general disruption, the city might revoke your license just to avoid noise." Rather than respond emotionally, Aaron followed Clara's lead. She filed a counter letter, not just defending the project but expanding its framing. Instead of simply reiterating the project's legality, Clara provided metrics, usage data from the meter logs, anonymized foot traffic captured by the adjacent city camera, and even 3 letters of support from unaffiliated residents. It was a reminder that legitimacy wasn't just about being right. It was about being methodically, visibly, structurally right. The city didn't revoke the license. They issued a request for Aaron to enhance visibility of usage terms. In response, he added a large format informational sign, professionally designed, laminated, and bolted to a steel post. It listed operating hours, fee structure, contact information for city inquiries, and a QR code linking to the city's Temporary Use Initiative portal. There was nothing provocative about it. It was dull by design, bureaucratic in tone, and absolutely bulletproof. But the message was clear. I'm not going anywhere. Then the personal attacks began, subtle at first. A strip of nails scattered near the base of his driveway. Graffiti. Just a crude, spray-painted "Didati" art mark on the back of the second meter's post. One morning he found his trash bin overturned and filled with yard debris that didn't come from his property. He didn't call the police. He logged it all, filed incident reports through the city's digital citizen portal, and forwarded everything to Clara. She advised against retaliation. "We stay on the ground they can't touch," she said. "If they get you to act out, they win." The board, meanwhile, launched their own neighborhood improvement campaign. It was exactly what it sounded like. Volunteer crews repainting curbs, replanting flowers, pressure washing sidewalk cracks. It should have been harmless, even commendable, but Aaron could see the intention behind it. This was a cleanup drive designed to make his small licensed parking zone seem like the stain on a polished floor. A local blogger, who mostly posted about food trucks and farmers markets, suddenly featured a segment titled "Urban Clutter When Private Projects Go Too Far." The photos showed Aaron's meters at unflattering angles under cloudy skies, edited to look harsh. The caption asked whether overregulation by individuals was harming collective neighborhood charm. Aaron didn't panic. He didn't counterpost or argue. He called a landscape designer. Not a flashy firm, just a solo contractor who specialized in native, low-maintenance urban plantings. Together, they installed a narrow planter strip around the base of the second meter, filled with drought-tolerant grasses and deep-rooted perennials, trimmed in black steel edging. It looked professional. It looked intentional. And once again, it looked better than anything the board had come up with in their improvement campaign. The photos he uploaded to the city's program site got picked up in a municipal newsletter under the title, "Innovative Curb Space Use in Emerging Urban Zones." That's when the board changed tactics. A new complaint was filed, this time to the Department of Transportation, claiming that Aaron's meters created a traffic hazard by narrowing sight lines for turning vehicles. The complaint included manipulated diagrams and photos with forced perspective, trying to show obstruction where none existed. Clara responded with drone imagery, traffic flow analysis from the city's own sensors, and statements from 2 licensed civil engineers. The department declined to act, citing insufficient cause. The board didn't stop. They shifted again. Karen began canvassing door to door. Aaron learned about it from a neighbor named Philip, who lived 2 houses down and had rarely spoken more than 5 words to him. "She came by," Philip said one evening almost sheepishly. "Asked me to sign something. Said it was to protect us from unsanctioned land grabs. I didn't sign." He looked uncomfortable. "I don't like what's happening, man. It's like she's trying to build a mob, and you're the only one not supposed to notice." Aaron thanked him, not just for the warning, but for the honesty. He knew Philip wasn't an ally. He was just tired of being asked to pick sides in a fight that never should have existed. The next escalation wasn't a note or a sign or a smear campaign. It was a formal notice, an official-looking envelope delivered by courier marked urgent. Inside was a letter from the residential board's legal counsel, alleging that Aaron's unauthorized occupation and commercial exploitation of previously communal infrastructure constituted grounds for collective action. It demanded immediate removal of both meters, restoration of the curb to its prior state, and threatened a class action claim if compliance wasn't met within 14 days. Clara read it twice and shook her head. It's bluster, legally empty, but dangerous if they convince people it's legitimate. Aaron didn't blink. Instead of reacting publicly, he went back to the planning office, this time with a copy of the threatening letter in hand. He requested a formal review of the parcel's use agreement, just to ensure no gaps had developed. The city official he met with, a man named Jordan, mid-40s with a tie too tight for comfort, reviewed the documentation and raised both eyebrows. "This is solid," he said, "but if they keep harassing you like this, you might consider converting to long-term license status. It takes a little more paperwork, but it'll stop most of this nonsense cold." Aaron filed the application that afternoon. The review process took 10 days, during which Aaron received 2 more anonymous letters, one threatening to expose his profiteering, the other accusing him of destroying community trust. Both were shredded, scanned, logged, and filed. Oh, the board didn't stop. They never would. But they were running out of tools, and Aaron wasn't giving them a single reason to strike effectively. When the approval finally came through, formal, signed, and certified, Aaron posted a copy of the license on the parking meters in protective sleeves. Beneath them, a new line of text. "This parcel is operated under a long-term urban enhancement license approved by the City of Redacted, in accordance with Use Clause 614, Reclaimed Infrastructure." The message wasn't loud, but it was final. The board didn't issue a response. Karen didn't knock on his door. No new signs appeared. The street quieted, in that eerie way a room does when everyone's waiting for someone else to speak first. Aaron continued his routine. He mowed his lawn, trimmed his trees, watered the plants along the curb. The meters ticked on. People parked, paid, left. Some waved, most didn't. But the important thing was that they used it, not because they had to, but because it was there. Or legal. Present. Untouchable. Aaron didn't feel triumphant. He didn't want to. But he did feel something stronger than satisfaction. Certainty. They had come for his space with arrogance, with silence, and then with noise. They had tried to bury him under their rules, and he had outmaneuvered them without ever stepping outside the bounds of the law. The cost had been time, patience, and a kind of resilience he hadn't known he possessed. But he'd earned every inch of ground. And now, they were the ones watching from behind curtains, unsure of what to do next. And that, Aaron thought, was exactly where he wanted them. The silence after the license approval was unnatural, almost theatrical. It wasn't the kind of quiet that followed resolution. It was the calm before a final maneuver, the kind of pause people take when they're deciding whether to double down or walk away. Aaron knew it. Clara knew it. Even the few neighbors who still made casual conversation with him felt it, as if waiting for the air to shift again. But for nearly a week, nothing happened. No more letters, no vandalism, no new zoning complaints. The meters continued operating. The planter remained intact. There were days when he caught Karen across the street, standing on the sidewalk in that way people do when they want to be noticed but not approached. She never crossed over. She never spoke. But the look in her eyes wasn't defeat. It was calculation. Then a letter arrived. Not a threat this time, but a notice of city review. A city planning representative named Byron Jenkins requested to meet with Aaron for a routine site verification associated with long-term parcel use. It was standard procedure, especially following a license upgrade, but the timing was suspect. Clara warned him to be cautious. "If they've leaned on someone inside the department," she said, "this could be their last shot, to catch a technicality and unravel your claim." Aaron agreed to the meeting and prepared everything. He printed duplicates of every approval, every photo, every incident report, and time-stamped communication. The day Jenkins arrived, Aaron greeted him at the curb. The man was in his early 50s, dressed neatly but plainly, clipboard in hand. His demeanor was professional, neutral, not cold but clearly trained not to reveal more than necessary. Aaron walked him through the parcel, explained the meter placement, the landscaping buffer, the sign visibility adjustments, and the use data logs. Jenkins nodded, took notes, and said little beyond the occasional "understood" or "okay." After 30 minutes, he thanked Aaron and promised a follow-up email by end of week. 3 days later, the email arrived, and it was worse than expected. Not in tone, but in vagueness. The message stated that the parcel would undergo a temporary administrative hold pending review of its impact on adjacent community spaces. It was a bureaucratic gray zone term, one that gave the city room to freeze operations without actually accusing Aaron of wrongdoing. Clara read it twice and immediately called him. "This reeks of outside pressure," she said. Someone has pushed for a stall tactic. They couldn't take you down directly, so they're trying to create a pause, force you into reactive territory. Aaron didn't panic. He responded by doing what the board never expected. He filed a complaint of his own, not through the city, but directly to the state ombudsman's office, requesting an audit of potential procedural interference within the planning department. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He simply laid out the timeline: anonymous threats, evidence of coordination, and the sudden freeze despite full legal compliance. Clara submitted a companion letter, citing both the long-term license and the lack of any prior violations or public objections within the review window. It wasn't a lawsuit, but it was a public move, and it meant documentation would be pulled, timelines would be examined, and motivations questioned. That was when the real mistake happened, and it didn't come from Aaron. Someone, whether out of desperation or pure arrogance, leaked an internal email thread from the residential board's private server. It wasn't a smoking gun by itself, but it was damning enough. Two, the emails revealed a coordinated effort among 3 board members, Karen included, to identify and exploit technical ambiguities in zoning definitions. One line in particular caught Clara's attention. Karen had written, "Even if we lose the meter fight, we need to make sure Weber's access claim never becomes permanent. Pressure them before the city starts to see his initiative as a model." That sentence was forwarded to the ombudsman's office. Now it was no longer about a neighborhood spat. It was about governance manipulation. Within days, a response arrived, not from Jenkins, but from his superior. The hold on the parcel was lifted immediately, citing insufficient grounds for delay. The review process was suspended. Aaron's license was reaffirmed in writing, and the planning department issued a quiet internal reminder that temporary use zones, once upgraded, must not be challenged retroactively without evidence of material harm. Clara smiled for the first time in weeks. "That's not just a win," she said. "That's precedent." But it wasn't over. Karen, either enraged or cornered, or both, filed a civil complaint against Aaron personally. She alleged that his installation of meters had caused emotional distress, property devaluation, and reputational harm to the community. The language was absurd, but the implications weren't. If a judge allowed the case to proceed, it could tie Aaron up in court for months. Clara wasn't surprised. "They're throwing their last spear," she said. "They know they've lost legally. This is meant to drain you emotionally and financially." Aaron didn't flinch. He authorized Clara to counterfile a motion to dismiss and, separately, a claim for legal harassment based on retaliatory litigation. He included every piece of evidence they'd gathered: letters, maps, threats, vandalism, procedural abuse. The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, and when the day came, Aaron didn't speak a word in court. Clara did all the talking. Calm, surgical, relentless. Karen's lawyer faltered under pressure, especially when the judge, after reviewing the initial filings, asked one pointed question. Was any of the plaintiff's property directly altered or damaged by the defendant's actions? The answer, of course, was no. The judge dismissed the complaint with prejudice. Karen stormed out of the courtroom. Aaron stayed seated until the room emptied. He wasn't gloating. He was exhausted. But he had one final action to take. Not revenge, just a quiet punctuation mark. He requested that the revenue generated from the curbside meters for the following 6 months be donated, half to the city's urban green space program, and half to a legal defense fund for low-income homeowners facing zoning disputes. He filed the donation under the same initiative that had given him the space to begin with. Not a victory lap, just restoration. A week later, the sign outside the board's office was quietly removed. No replacement followed. Aaron didn't celebrate. But one morning, standing on his front porch with a cup of black coffee in hand, he watched as a city worker walked up to the planter, snapped a photo, and entered a quick note into a handheld tablet. The man didn't notice Aaron. He was just doing his job, logging condition updates for licensed urban projects. That was what Aaron's meters were now. A line item. Ordinary. Approved. Permanent. It was over. And it was his. The neighborhood never formally acknowledged what happened. No one apologized, no one asked questions, and certainly no one offered a handshake or a quiet olive branch. But the tension, thick and aggressive for months, began to diffuse into something different. Stillness. People began waving again. A few even stopped to comment on the plants around the meters or ask about the city permit process. But there was no mention of the concrete, no reference to the meetings, the petitions, or the lawsuit. The war had ended without fanfare, and the silence afterward felt almost surreal. Aaron didn't need recognition. He wasn't interested in vindication. What he valued now was something much simpler and rarer. Uninterrupted ownership. The right to exist on his property without interference, pressure, or reinvention from others. And he had earned it in full. The parking meters stayed. The revenue trickled in modestly, enough to cover maintenance and the occasional donation to the city's public use fund. The plants filled in gradually, their roots anchoring deeper each season. At times, unfamiliar cars parked on the strip, visitors to nearby homes or service vans, and Aaron would catch glimpses of people feeding coins into the meter without hesitation. That small, simple gesture, compliance without conflict, meant more to him than he expected. It wasn't about control. It was about recognition, silent acknowledgement that space, when rightfully claimed and respectfully used, commanded respect without demanding it. The driveway, still sealed in concrete, remained untouched. He had considered tearing it out, restoring it to gravel as a final statement of autonomy. But over time, he came to see it differently. It was no longer the mark of their intrusion. It was the monument to their miscalculation. The plaque, once a symbol of arrogance, had been quietly chiseled off months earlier, leaving only a faint outline where the lettering once was. He left the concrete as it was, not out of acceptance, but because it no longer dictated anything. It was just a surface now, no longer a symbol. His actions had redefined the conflict, and with that, had redefined the meaning of the very thing they had used to provoke him. Karen remained in the neighborhood, though her influence noticeably faded. She no longer chaired the community board. Rumor had it she'd stepped down voluntarily, citing burnout, but Aaron didn't need confirmation. He knew what she had lost: credibility, momentum, the quiet obedience of those who once feared her authority more than they questioned it. She still walked the same routes, still offered the same pinch smiles to those willing to acknowledge her, but the way people looked at her had changed. Her words no longer carried weight. They lingered in the air like background noise, irrelevant to the structure she had once tried so hard to control. Clara closed the file 6 weeks after the judge's ruling. "You've got a clean slate now," she told him over coffee at a quiet cafe just outside city limits. "If they ever try again, it'll be treated as retaliation from minute one." Aaron nodded, grateful but not eager to look back. He'd spent too many hours immersed in paperwork, preparing statements, parsing threats disguised as invitations. He was done being reactive. The fight hadn't changed who he was, but it had clarified it. He had never been someone to seek confrontation, but if pushed, he would answer with precision and endurance. Now, he was at peace. Not because the battle was easy, but because he hadn't flinched when it mattered. In the months that followed, Aaron began to reclaim the time he'd lost. He resumed the restoration work on the porch, repainted the trim, resealed the windows. The physical tasks felt honest, therapeutic even, something real to contrast the artificial drama of the months before. He started growing vegetables in containers along the rear fence, something he'd always meant to try. He never posted photos, never told anyone. It wasn't for show. It was for him. Small routines, private rewards. Occasionally, new residents would move in, young couples or quiet professionals, unfamiliar with the neighborhood's history. Some asked about the parking meter in passing, usually with polite curiosity. Aaron always explained the system simply and factually, never mentioning the long legal struggle behind it. It wasn't their burden. It didn't need to be. The conflict had served its purpose. The space was safe now, guarded not by walls or aggression, but by precedent, by law, by the steady documentation of a man who refused to be quietly erased. He kept all the files. Printed, sorted, dated. Not out of paranoia, but for the record. A personal archive of how far someone could go, quietly, without fanfare, when pushed by forces that mistook quiet for weak. He never expected to need them again, but then he'd never expected to need them the first time. Ownership, he had learned, wasn't just about what you buy. It was about what you defend. And sometimes it was about knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to simply stand your ground long enough for others to realize you aren't going anywhere. Aaron stood on his porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the concrete they'd poured to force him out. It caught the light differently now, not as something foreign, but as something reclaimed. It was no longer a scar. It was a line he had crossed and won.